Daniel Okoro walked the immaculate halls of his family's sprawling estate with a sense of detachment that no amount of luxury could erase. To the outside world, he was the golden heir, the privileged son of a billionaire, the future leader of a sprawling business empire. Yet beneath the surface of privilege and power, Daniel felt an unshakable loneliness, a gnawing void that wealth and status could never fill. The grandeur surrounding him was nothing but an elaborate facade, a mask that hid the deep unrest brewing within his soul. From a young age, Daniel had been molded to fit a carefully scripted destiny, a role defined by expectations rather than desires. His childhood was a series of lessons in diplomacy and leadership, lessons in how to speak and behave as the future of the Okoro legacy. Yet, no matter how polished his exterior became, he struggled with the silent weight of isolation. Genuine human connections seemed like a distant myth, obscured by the constant glare of his family's name and fortune. Every smile he received felt rehearsed, every friendship tinged with the suspicion of hidden motives. He questioned whether anyone truly saw him, or merely the title he carried. The pressure to conform to his predetermined path was suffocating. Daniel found himself trapped between who he was expected to be and who he actually was, a young man yearning for authenticity in a world that demanded performance. His heart ached not for wealth or power, but for moments of unguarded truth, for relationships untainted by privilege. The more he tried to find these moments within his gilded cage, the more elusive they became, like shadows slipping through his fingers. Despite the external perfection, the luxury cars, the grand parties, the influential connections, Daniel felt like a stranger to himself. The legacy he was meant to inherit felt less like a gift and more like a chain, binding him to a life scripted by others. His identity was fragmented, torn between duty and desire, between the man the world expected and the man he longed to become. Beneath the surface of inherited wealth lay a restless spirit, quietly questioning, quietly resisting, aching to break free from the invisible prison of his own making. Under the cover of dusk, Daniel Okoro slipped into the dark uniform of the estate's night security guard, the fabric rough against his skin, a stark contrast to the tailored suits that usually defined him. The disguise was more than just a costume, it was a liberation, a temporary shedding of the heavy mantle that suffocated him daily. In this simple uniform, he was invisible, just another anonymous figure blending into the shadows. For the first time in years, Daniel tasted the bittersweet freedom of anonymity. As he patrolled the perimeter, the familiar walls of his estate felt strangely foreign, as if he were an outsider peering in rather than an heir trapped within. The silence of the night wrapped around him, punctuated only by the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the city. It was in this quiet that Daniel confronted the profound loneliness that gnawed at him, a loneliness not cured by wealth or status, but only deepened by their isolating glow. The uniform concealed his face, yet it could not mask the turmoil simmering beneath his calm exterior. Every step on the gravel felt like a step away from the persona the world demanded of him, but also a step toward an internal reckoning. Daniel found himself watching the estate through new eyes, noticing details he had never cared to see before: the cracked paint on the garden gate, the flicker of a faulty porch light, the way shadows pooled in hidden corners. These imperfections mirrored his own fractured identity, a reminder that beneath the polished surface lay cracks waiting to be acknowledged. In this guise, Daniel met the unseen pulse of his world: the tired night shift workers, the quiet custodians, the unnoticed souls who kept the estate running while the elite slept. Their faces held stories unburdened by privilege, their conversations raw and unfiltered. For the first time, Daniel glimpsed a life unshadowed by expectation, where people lived and struggled simply, without the weight of inherited destiny. The interactions were brief, but they stirred something deep within him, a yearning for genuine connection, for a place where he could be known without the trappings of wealth. Yet, even as he embraced this new role, the psychological toll of living a double life weighed heavily on him. The fear of discovery, the tension between truth and disguise, pulled at the edges of his mind. Daniel grappled with the paradox of seeking freedom through concealment, questioning whether he was running towards something real or simply fleeing the unbearable reality of his own existence. The uniform, once a symbol of escape, became a mirror reflecting his fractured self, an embodiment of the internal war between who he was and who he longed to be. Night after night, Daniel continued his secret patrols, each step weaving deeper into the fabric of his hidden self. In the silence of the dark, he found a fragile clarity, a space where the masks could fall away and the truth, however painful, could be faced. And though the path ahead was uncertain, Daniel felt, perhaps for the first time, the faint stirrings of hope that beyond the shadows of his own making, a life lived authentically might someday be within reach. The factory was a world away from the polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers of Daniel Okoro's family estate, a place of relentless noise, grease-stained hands, and a rhythm dictated by machines that never rested. When Daniel stepped through the heavy metal doors, trading his tailored suits or security uniform for the rough coveralls of a factory worker, he felt both a strange liberation and a piercing dissonance. Here, the air was thick with the scent of oil and metal, the cacophony of clanging steel and hissing steam filling every corner. It was a harsh, unforgiving environment, but it was also honest, a stark contrast to the polished facades and empty conversations he was accustomed to. The men and women around him bore faces etched with exhaustion and determination, their hands scarred by the demands of labor. They worked with a gritty resolve, their movements shaped by years of repetition, their eyes reflecting the weight of responsibilities far removed from the luxury Daniel knew. For him, this world was unfamiliar and at times overwhelming, yet beneath the surface, it held a raw authenticity that called to the part of him yearning for real connection. The camaraderie was real here, forged in sweat and shared hardship, not painted smiles and obligatory greetings. Daniel's role was menial, a far cry from the power and influence his name promised. Each day, as he operated the grinding machines or sorted heavy crates, he grappled with a torrent of conflicting emotions, shame mingled with relief, fear tangled with hope. The factory stripped away his inherited identity, forcing him to confront himself in the mirror of hard work and simple truths. Yet even here, in the noise and grit, his mind wandered to the invisible chains of expectation waiting for him outside these walls. Conversations with his coworkers offered fleeting glimpses into lives shaped by struggle and resilience, lives lived without the cushion of privilege. They spoke of worries over bills, hopes for their children's futures, and frustrations with the endless grind. Daniel listened more than he spoke, absorbing their stories as if trying to anchor himself in a reality he had long been denied. These exchanges stirred a quiet revolution within him, an awakening to the complexities and contradictions of life beyond wealth and status. But the factory was not just a refuge, it was a crucible. The physical exhaustion mirrored the psychological strain of living a double life. Daniel's hands ached not only from labor, but from the effort to hold together the fragmented pieces of his existence. The fatigue settled deep in his bones, a constant reminder of the price he paid for this borrowed freedom. He feared discovery, not just by his family, but by himself. Could he reconcile the son of privilege with the factory worker he had become, or was he destined to live divided, forever torn between two worlds? As the machines roared around him, Daniel found himself searching for meaning in the monotony. Each repetitive task became a meditation on identity and belonging, each break a moment to question who he was beneath the roles imposed upon him. The factory's harsh reality exposed his vulnerabilities, but also illuminated a stubborn spark of resilience. In the midst of the grinding gears and clanging metal, Daniel began to understand that the struggle for authenticity was not a battle to be won in grand gestures, but a quiet, persistent fight waged in the spaces between noise and silence, labor and longing. The tension that had been quietly building beneath Daniel's carefully constructed facade finally erupted one restless night, shaking the fragile balance he had fought so hard to maintain. The weight of living between two worlds, one gilded and pristine, the other raw and unvarnished, pressed down on him with unbearable force. The factory, with its honest brutality, had become a refuge, yet it was also a cage where his hidden life was at constant risk of exposure. That risk was no longer a distant shadow, but a looming threat that haunted every step he took. It began with a careless slip, a momentary lapse in vigilance during his night patrol that almost exposed him to one of the estate's senior staff. The man's sharp eyes had lingered too long, a flicker of suspicion lighting up behind them. Daniel's heart had slammed against his ribs, the cold flood of panic paralyzing him for a heartbeat before he forced himself to retreat into the protective cloak of darkness. The close call shattered the illusion of safety, making clear that his double existence was a precarious balancing act, one misstep away from unraveling everything. This near exposure ignited a storm within Daniel's mind, a tumult of fear, guilt, and defiance that battered his psyche relentlessly. He questioned the wisdom of his secret escapades, wondering if the brief taste of freedom was worth the risk to everything he had been raised to protect. Yet beneath the fear was a stubborn, aching need to continue, to hold onto the glimpses of authenticity he found among the night shadows and factory walls. The duality tore at him, a relentless war between the dutiful son society expected and the fractured man desperate to breathe. At work, the strain began to manifest in subtle but undeniable ways. His hands, once steady and sure, trembled with exhaustion and anxiety. His eyes, always watchful, grew haunted with sleepless nights and relentless self-questioning. Colleagues noticed his withdrawal, whispering about the change in his demeanor, but Daniel remained guarded, unable to share the chaos raging beneath his composed exterior. The isolation deepened, each secret adding another layer to the walls he built around himself. The emotional pressure found a brutal outlet one evening when a confrontation with a co-worker spiraled out of control. Words meant to be simple exchanges turned sharp and biting, exposing fissures in Daniel's carefully curated identity. The co-worker's frustration, born from years of hardship and broken dreams, collided violently with Daniel's pent-up resentment and fear. The argument left Daniel shaken, a raw wound reminding him that no matter how far he ran, he could not escape the gravity of his fractured self. Back at the estate, whispers began to circulate, rumors sparked by subtle observations and unexplained absences. The family, tight-knit and watchful, started closing in with a quiet suspicion that threatened to suffocate Daniel's secret. Each glance from his father, each pointed question from his mother, became an unbearable weight. The very walls of the estate, once symbols of security, now felt like a prison closing in on him, the suffocating legacy of expectations and duty. Caught in this tightening noose, Daniel faced the ultimate crucible, to confront the fractured pieces of his identity head-on or to retreat entirely into the role imposed upon him. The psychological battle was raw and unyielding, relentless dialogue between hope and despair, courage and fear. In the darkest hours, he grappled with his reflection, not just the man the world saw, but the one hidden beneath layers of disguise and denial. The conflict was no longer external alone. It had become an internal battlefield where every choice carried the weight of potential ruin or redemption. And yet, amidst the turmoil, a fragile resolve began to take root. Daniel sensed that the path forward demanded not silence or concealment but confrontation, a reckoning with the truths he had long buried. The challenges ahead were daunting, the risks immense, but the alternative was a life fragmented and hollow. In this crucible of conflict and trial, Daniel stood on the precipice of transformation, where the pain of breaking apart might be the necessary passage to becoming whole. The moment Daniel saw the harsh words aimed at Sophia, something inside him snapped, a surge of protectiveness that cut through the fog of his own turmoil. Sophia, with her quiet strength and unwavering kindness, had become a rare anchor in his fractured world. She was more than just a friend or coworker. She embodied a hope and dignity that Daniel feared slipping away in the relentless grind of their lives. To witness her attacked, dismissed so casually by those who could not see beyond their own bitterness, was like a knife twisting in his chest. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside. The confrontation was not just about defending Sophia. It was an eruption of all the pent-up frustration, fear, and anger he had buried beneath his composed surface. As he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had seen the harshness of life from both ends, the polished privilege he was born into and the grinding reality Sophia faced every day. He challenged the cruelty masked as indifference, demanding respect not only for her but for the humanity that often went unseen in their world. Sophia's eyes met his, a flicker of gratitude mingled with surprise. She had grown accustomed to carrying burdens silently, masking pain behind a brave smile. But in that moment, Daniel's defense was more than just words. It was an affirmation that she mattered, that her struggles were recognized and valued. It was a fragile but powerful connection, a lifeline in a world too often cruel and dismissive. Yet beneath his outward courage, Daniel's mind was a tempest of doubt and fear. He wondered if this act of defense would mark him, expose his divided existence to those who watched closely. Every protective instinct battled with the paralyzing awareness of what he risked, his family's wrath, the precarious balance he maintained between worlds, and the fragile sense of self he was still trying to hold together. The internal conflict was a knot tightening around his heart, a reminder that courage often came with a price. As the tension in the room thickened, Daniel's thoughts spiraled deeper. He understood all too well the isolation Sophia endured, the subtle judgments, the whispered criticisms, the invisible barriers erected by a society unwilling to acknowledge her worth. His defense was not just an act of rebellion, but a deeply personal declaration against the injustice that sought to diminish them both. It was a silent vow that, no matter the cost, he would stand beside her in the face of cruelty and neglect. The aftermath was quiet but heavy. The room held its breath, the air charged with unspoken challenges and fragile alliances. Sophia's expression softened, a tentative trust blooming between them. Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle firmly on his shoulders, not just to protect her, but to confront the deeper fractures in a world that forced them into roles of victim and defender. In that charged silence, Daniel glimpsed a painful truth, that defending Sophia was also a defense of his own fractured identity. It was a stand against the loneliness that had threatened to consume him, a refusal to let the silence of suffering become their shared fate. Through the turmoil and fear, a fragile strength began to grow, a testament to the resilience born from connection, empathy, and the courage to face the harshness of reality together. The fragile veil of secrecy that Daniel had painstakingly maintained began to tear, thread by trembling thread, until one unforgiving evening it was ripped apart with a sudden, merciless force. The discovery came not with a dramatic confrontation but in a quiet, devastating moment, an unintended glimpse, a misplaced word, a shadow of truth caught by wary eyes. It was enough. The carefully constructed walls he had built to protect himself crumbled under the weight of suspicion and silent accusation. His family, once a sanctuary of unspoken expectations and rigid affection, transformed overnight into a tribunal where judgment hung heavy in the air like a thick fog. His father's gaze, usually steady and commanding, flickered with something unrecognizable, betrayal, confusion, and a deep, wounded pride. His mother's voice, once warm and soothing, hardened into sharp questions, each one a blade that cut deeper than words. The house that had nurtured him now felt like a cage closing in, every corner echoing with the unspoken disappointment that seeped through the walls. Daniel's mind became a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts and emotions. The shock of exposure was only the beginning. What followed was a slow, suffocating erosion of trust that gnawed at his very core. He replayed every moment leading up to the discovery, searching for the misstep, the sign he had missed. Doubt tangled with shame, and a crushing loneliness settled in, a profound isolation not just from others, but from the self he thought he knew. The conversations with his family were battles fought in silence and in sharp, clipped words. Each interaction became a careful dance of words avoided and truths half told. His father's disappointment was not only in Daniel's actions, but in what those actions represented: a fracture in the legacy, a challenge to the carefully upheld image of their family. The love Daniel had known felt conditional now, tethered to conformity and the price of obedience. His mother, torn between protectiveness and societal expectation, oscillated between cold reproach and fragile, broken moments of vulnerability. Within himself, Daniel wrestled with a tide of conflicting feelings: guilt for the pain he had caused, anger at the suffocating expectations that had driven him to secrecy, and a desperate yearning for acceptance that felt more distant than ever. The loss of trust was a wound that cut deeper than any outward conflict, a rupture that echoed through every corner of his existence. He felt exposed and raw, as if the discovery had stripped away not only his secrets, but his very identity. The isolation was both external and internal. Friends and allies who had sensed his struggles now kept a cautious distance, unsure of how to bridge the growing chasm. Daniel, in turn, retreated further into himself, the walls around his heart rising higher with each passing day. The psychological weight of betrayal, both given and received, became a suffocating presence, coloring every thought with shades of despair and fear. Yet beneath the rubble of broken trust, a flicker of painful clarity began to emerge. Daniel realized that the fractures, though deep and disorienting, also revealed the parts of himself he had long hidden, even from himself. The loss forced him to confront truths he had avoided: the need to reconcile his divided life, the courage required to face judgment not with silence but with honesty, and the painful but necessary work of rebuilding, piece by fragile piece. In this dark crucible of discovery and loss, Daniel stood at a crossroads. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with the risk of further rejection but also the possibility of renewal. The psychological drama of broken trust became a battleground not just for acceptance by others, but for a deeper acceptance within, a journey toward a self no longer fractured by fear, but strengthened by the painful truths uncovered in the shattering of illusions. In the aftermath of the shattering revelation, Daniel found himself standing amid the ruins of his relationships, burdened by a profound sense of guilt that clung to him like a second skin. The weight of broken trust pressed relentlessly on his shoulders, and with it came an aching desire, a desperate, fragile hope to mend what had been fractured, to bridge the widening chasm between himself and those he loved. But the path to redemption was neither straightforward nor swift. It demanded more than mere apologies or hollow promises. It required an unflinching reckoning with his own failings, a painstaking unraveling of the walls he had built around his vulnerability. His efforts began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the spaces between conversations and the silences that followed. Daniel learned to listen with more than just his ears. He listened with his heart, attentive to the subtle shifts in tone, the flicker of doubt or hesitation, the guarded glances that spoke volumes. Each moment became an opportunity to prove, not through words alone but through consistent actions, that he was committed to change. It was a slow, grueling process, fraught with setbacks and moments where despair threatened to overwhelm hope. In the intimate, often uncomfortable conversations that ensued, Daniel grappled with the raw honesty demanded of him. He confronted the shadows of his past mistakes without defense or evasion, revealing his fears, his regrets, and the truths he had long buried beneath layers of silence. Vulnerability became his currency, a difficult exchange in a world that prized strength and stoicism, but it was the only way forward. He began to share not only his struggles, but also his aspirations for a future where trust could be rebuilt, where love could be unconditional rather than contingent on perfection. His family, wounded but not irreparably broken, responded in ways as varied as their own pain and hopes. His father's stern demeanor softened incrementally, cracks appearing in the armor of disappointment as he witnessed Daniel's persistent efforts. It was in the small, unguarded moments, a shared meal, a quiet nod of acknowledgement, a word of encouragement, that the first tentative threads of reconciliation were woven. His mother, too, oscillated between lingering resentment and glimpses of forgiveness, her protective instincts battling with the reality of change. Daniel's internal landscape was a battleground of conflicting emotions, shame and pride, fear and courage, hopelessness and determination. Each day demanded a renewal of commitment, a refusal to succumb to the despair that lurked at the edges of his consciousness. The psychological toll was immense. Healing trust was not a destination but a journey marked by continuous effort and painful self-reflection. Yet within this struggle lay the seeds of transformation, a deeper understanding of himself and the relationships he sought to nurture. Gradually, the walls of isolation began to crumble, replaced by bridges forged in honesty and patience. Friends who had distanced themselves hesitated, then slowly returned, offering tentative support and renewed connection. Daniel's world, once shadowed by secrecy and fear, started to regain color and texture as he embraced the messiness of imperfection and the possibility of growth. Through this painstaking process of redemption, Daniel came to realize that trust, once broken, could not simply be restored by force or will alone. It required time, empathy, and the courage to remain open even when vulnerability felt like exposure. The journey was as much about forgiving himself as about earning forgiveness from others, a psychological odyssey that reshaped his understanding of love, loyalty, and the fragile, enduring nature of human connection. Emerging from the long shadow of broken trust and tentative reconciliation, Daniel found himself facing the most daunting challenge yet, the task of building relationships that were not just fragile repairs, but genuine, authentic connections rooted in understanding and mutual acceptance. It was a process that demanded far more than surface-level gestures or rehearsed apologies. It required an unveiling of his true self, the parts long hidden beneath layers of fear, shame, and self-protection. This journey toward real intimacy was neither linear nor simple. It was fraught with uncertainty, vulnerability, and the constant negotiation between hope and doubt. At the heart of this transformation was Daniel's growing awareness that authenticity could not be achieved without honesty, not just with others but first and foremost with himself. Each conversation became a mirror reflecting his deepest fears and desires, forcing him to confront the dissonance between who he had been and who he aspired to become. The walls that once protected him from pain now threatened to isolate him, and so he learned to dismantle them, brick by brick, exposing the raw, unvarnished truth beneath. This exposure was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. It left him open to judgment and rejection, but also created the fertile ground for trust to take root. The family dynamics shifted subtly but meaningfully as Daniel moved away from defensiveness toward vulnerability. His interactions were marked less by the need to explain or justify, and more by a willingness to listen deeply and respond with empathy. He began to see his parents not as adversaries or obstacles, but as complex individuals shaped by their own fears and histories. This shift allowed space for compassion to emerge, softening the sharp edges of past conflicts. Moments that once would have exploded into anger or silence now held the possibility of understanding and connection, even when agreement remained elusive. Beyond family, Daniel extended this newfound openness to friendships and relationships that had been strained or neglected. He reached out with humility, acknowledging past wounds without allowing them to define the present. In these exchanges, he discovered the delicate balance between asserting his needs and honoring those of others, a balance that required continuous self-reflection and emotional courage. The fear of rejection lingered like a shadow, but it no longer dictated his actions. Instead, it became a reminder of the stakes involved in genuine connection, lending weight and meaning to each tentative step forward. Within himself, Daniel wrestled with the paradox of wanting closeness while fearing exposure. The psychological struggle was intense. How to remain true to his vulnerabilities without being consumed by them, how to invite others in without losing himself in the process. This internal dialogue was a constant undercurrent, shaping his interactions and coloring his emotional landscape. At times, the effort to maintain this delicate equilibrium left him exhausted and discouraged, But each small breakthrough, an honest conversation, a shared laugh, a moment of silent understanding, rekindled his resolve. The building of real relationships became an act of courage, a continuous choice to trust despite the risks. Daniel came to appreciate that authenticity was less about perfection and more about presence, the willingness to show up fully, flaws and all, and to accept the imperfect humanity in others. This shift in perspective transformed his sense of connection from a fragile hope to a resilient possibility. The bonds forged through this process were not without their challenges, but they carried a depth and richness that had previously seemed out of reach. In this psychological landscape of growth and healing, Daniel's journey illuminated a profound truth, that the essence of true relationship lies not in seamless harmony or unbroken trust, but in the shared willingness to navigate complexity, to hold space for pain and joy alike, and to build bridges over the chasms of misunderstanding. It was a fragile, ongoing dance, one that demanded patience, empathy, and above all, an unyielding commitment to the messy, beautiful reality of being truly seen and truly known. As Daniel stood at the crossroads of his journey, the echoes of everything he had endured, the betrayals, the painstaking efforts to rebuild, resonated within him with a clarity that was both sobering and quietly empowering. It was in this moment of reflection that the true weight of his experience revealed itself, not as a burden to be carried endlessly, but as a series of lessons etched deep into the fabric of his being. The path he had walked was riddled with hardship, yet it had also been a crucible forging a deeper understanding of himself and the fragile nature of human connection. The realization dawned slowly, layered with nuance, that life's most profound growth often springs from the rawest wounds, and that healing is not a destination, but an ongoing process. He recognized that trust, once broken, does not simply snap back into place like a repaired object. It transforms into something more complex, more resilient, but also more delicate. Trust, Daniel understood, is less about certainty and more about the courage to remain open despite the risks of disappointment and hurt. This insight settled within him not as a defeat, but as a kind of quiet strength, a willingness to embrace vulnerability as the foundation for genuine connection. He saw now that the fractures in relationships, painful though they were, could become the very points through which light entered, illuminating truths that had previously been obscured by denial or fear. Daniel's journey also illuminated the imperative of self-forgiveness. The psychological drama of his inner world, the relentless self-criticism, the cycles of guilt and shame, had threatened to trap him in a spiral of despair. But through the act of facing his flaws honestly, he began to disentangle his worth from his mistakes. Forgiving himself did not mean excusing the past, but rather accepting that imperfection was intrinsic to the human experience. This acceptance was a necessary prelude to extending forgiveness outward, enabling him to approach others with compassion rather than judgment. The dual process of self-forgiveness and empathy became a cornerstone of his renewed relationships. Moreover, Daniel came to understand that meaningful connection demands patience, not just with others, but with oneself. The psychological wounds and the process of rebuilding could not be rushed. They required time, persistence, and the humility to accept setbacks as part of growth. He learned that progress often unfolds in small, nearly invisible increments rather than dramatic leaps, and that these quiet moments of persistence build the foundation for lasting change. In embracing this slower rhythm, he found a paradoxical freedom, the freedom to be imperfect, to falter, and yet to continue moving forward with intention. In the end, the story of Daniel's transformation is not merely about repairing damage, but about evolving into a more authentic self, one shaped by the interplay of vulnerability and strength. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, capable of facing the darkest internal struggles and emerging with a renewed capacity for love and trust. His experience underscores a profound psychological truth, that the deepest wounds, while painful, carry within them the seeds of growth, and that embracing the complexity of our emotional lives allows us to connect more deeply with others and ourselves. This conclusion is not a neat resolution, but an open-ended invitation to acknowledge our frailties, to accept the messiness of human relationships, and to find courage in the ongoing work of healing. Daniel's journey reminds us that psychological depth and emotional authenticity are not just ideals, but essential paths to living fully, imperfectly, and ultimately profoundly connected.